Hello, folks on YouTube, and welcome to another episode of my Singularity Let's Play. It's Northstar. Sorry, I'm already mincing my words. It's not even that far into my day. Woke up to the sound of smoke detectors going off, because apparently people can't control their freaking impatience. It's like, okay, if the stove always seems to work on hot and hotter than hell and doesn't seem to be able to do moderation, and you need to not crank it up too far instead of constantly setting off the smoke alarm just because you're impatient. It's ridiculous. All that smoke causes me to cough, and then they get irritated at me, the people I stay with, about my cough. It's like, you're injecting smoke into the air with a careless cooking. Literally causing the problem I'm complaining about. But whatever. Air circulation isn't great, so it makes its way right into my room, the kitchen. Sure you folks don't want to hear me talk about my own life, though. Let's see what's going on in the world. Our idiot-in-chief has his personal attorney, and I mean crony, I mean loyalist, I mean head of the Department of Justice, going around openly, aggressively doubling down on persecuting his political opponents and essentially mocking the Senate and Congress. I don't know if you watch this channel, but Ted Sturmer, who has a YouTube channel, is a historian, did an excellent little bit of commentary on it. He's a resistance historian who I think he's a visiting scholar from the University of Denmark or something. He speaks perfect English. Maybe he's two. It's not clear. He originally studied the American Revolution in the start of his history career, though. From the Atlantic School perspective. In that era, I guess stuff before it too. Anyways. But yeah. Some outright fascist shit going on there. Also, I think it was it John Oliver? Someone was making fun of something Trump said, which it was incoherent, and he doesn't have the excuse of being disabled on COVID like I do, which makes me sometimes a little bit incoherent. Struggling to connect my thoughts even when I knew exactly what I was going to say before. Really does suck the way this affects my brain. I was on the verge of becoming a physician with an amazing MCAT score. Really, people, sometimes they would demand to know what I got, thinking I must not have done well if I wasn't already a doctor by my age. And then they're like, oh, they just assume I must have done something bad instead of having cursed luck. But I went to a special master's. I didn't have amazing undergrad grades, but went to school and did a degree in inflation. I wasn't a pre-med at the time, so I didn't need the straight A's. But anyways, I did a special master's. I got straight A's. Had an amazing MCAT score. A really good one I did again and got an amazing one the second time. Finishing up in my final semester. It's already done all the classes for special masters and was doing some for another master's. Just had to do my research for special masters. And then I got disabled on COVID. Future torn away from me, and I get to be shot on by people who don't treat me with the respect they would have if I had, say, finished med school before getting disabled, and they had to call me a doctor. then maybe they treat me worse. But who knows? Some people are going to be shady to you no matter what. But I get this all over the place. If you're living in poverty, people automatically assume you've done something wrong, rather than the system does nothing to care for those in vulnerable positions and screws over people for all sorts of reasons. Like, I can't get SSDI because I was screwed out of that. Because the way they did it is I had to basically work full-time for 5 of the 10 years since I turned 21, because it was disabled 31. And more than half of those years, 6 of those 10 years, I'd spent in graduate school or undergrad, because I turned 21 after my 3rd year of undergrad, like most people do. But a little later than most. It was a little bit younger than most of my classmates. But while you're a student, jobs due for university, even if it's paid work and there are workers doing the same work, we're not students who are getting payroll tax contributions. You don't get it, and then it doesn't count towards SSDI work credits. It's not like any young person is thinking about SSDI work credits or even probably knows they exist, like I didn't. I certainly wasn't thinking I could qualify for disability at the age of 21. It was not. That thought never crossed my radar. So, yeah. This was rolled by Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton in the mid-90s. It also screwed people who work for religious institutions. Mind you, this isn't while they're in school. This is like you graduate college, you go to work for a religious institution or certain types of charities or nonprofits. So, you go work for a faith-based charity after college, you're not getting work credits. You get disabled even though you've been working full-time for maybe your entire time since turning 21. You still get screwed. Certain types of government employees also get screwed, though that's because they have their own type of disability pensions. So, but they lose out on SSDI and get a government one that sometimes is not actually as good as SSDI from like the state government or local government in certain cases. Yeah, all these holes that have been poked into the social safety net, which, of course, shitty bureaucrats will even deny it is a social safety net. So it's an insurance program. Yeah, it's an insurance program like the health insurance that doesn't actually pay when you get sick, but charges insane premiums. Always has an excuse why not to honor their commitments. That's the kind of insurance it's like. But capitalism poisons everything. And it's a system that it will eat itself eventually, like an Ouroboros eating its own, sneaking its own tail. But anyways, Trump, to pivot back to my original topic, Trump said something about China and ships, and I think it was Jon Stewart, or maybe it was John Oliver, was making fun of it as indicative of dementia. Granddad used to sing how to tell when our loved ones have dementia, when to say goodbye or something. It was making fun of Trump. But what he said, if in his own disconnected way, the comedians might not have recognized what it was about. Maybe it was some shitty social democrat YouTuber, I don't know. The comedians and the pundits might not realize what that was about, but I immediately keyed into what he was talking about clearly, and it's concerning when you know what it was about. Clearly, Trump had asked why we couldn't just attack China, as in start a war with them, and he got a briefing, or maybe he got a briefing and then he asked this question, but the way he was going on, it was pretty clear that he basically asked about the strategic situation of a war across the Pacific with China, and got the explanation, because this is something that's well known in strategic circles. China can build ships much, 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 much faster than the United States. The U.S. has basically ceased to do any kind of really substantial shipbuilding. It barely builds enough ships to keep up the current size of its fleet. Can't expand it or replace losses at a rapid clip or any of that. And so Trump was probably told that basically it'd be a standoff, because the U.S. would have a fleet that would either stupidly lose in the opening days of war, or would have to deploy very carefully to avoid losing because it couldn't replace the losses. Whereas China would be able to build ships much faster than the U.S. and eventually have a much bigger fleet in a drawn-out war. There'd be no way to bring it to a quick conclusion, but it'd be obviously crippling to China's economic growth, so it would probably just end up with a ceasefire. I.e., the U.S. couldn't actually win such a war unless it could win it very quickly. And if it did, it would take risks that could force an actual defeat if the U.S. lost a lot of its ships trying to force a rapid end to the war and failed. If it did a Pearl Harbor type gambit and lost, it'd be like the Pacific War and World War II, except the U.S. being the stand-in for Japan, not the U.S. this time around. But yeah, I've read articles by some of these military strategist types who write stuff like this right on the internet and such, magazines for frickin' honestly geared towards like the billionaires and their people who spend all their time thinking about how to grow the global empire. They put some of their shit right out in the open. They don't care. They also have strategic studies programs, universities. It's the empire isn't even hidden, really. Just have to know where to look. It's a lot of it's open secrets. Just like when the Heritage Foundation did the Project for a New American Century, and they had a PowerPoint of all the countries they wanted to invade. These pricks don't even hide their imperialist ambitions at all. The U.S. is the world's largest empire. But anyways, yeah, but they've done multiple analysis and published it, and it's out there. You can read about it, about what would happen in war with China. And so clearly, Trump had asked about this or been told about this. But the fact that it was even on his mind was concerning, because it said that besides deploying troops to U.S. cities and abducting people off the streets and sending them to basically concentration camps in Latin America and denying scientific facts, he's still doing that shit. Not just about climate change, but stuff to do with COVID and such. Long COVID and all that. But besides being an ignorant piece of shit, he's, looking at starting a war with China. He calls himself a great peacemaker or whatever, but what Trump's real game has to try and withdraw the U.S. out of these imperialist conflicts like Africa and stuff to free up troops to potentially attack China and do some saber rattling against Russia, though it's clear he doesn't want a war with Russia. He considers Putin more of an ally than a threat, Trump, or a potential ally against China. What Trump wants to do is turn Russia against China and attack them, whereas what the Democrats want to do is break Russia into a million pieces and build military bases in eastern Russia and attack China. Either way, they want to make some and turn some of those little fragmentary successor states into allies. Either way, both parties want to turn all or part of Russia against China and try and repeat what they did in the Cold War, where they turned China against Russia and use that to help win the Cold War. Which the Maoists in the room can go suck it. They're going to say, oh, it was necessary, whatever. No, they betrayed socialist principles, and it helped ensure the fall of the Soviet Union and all its allied states, and that made socialism in the third world virtually impossible, because China put their own short-term interests ahead of, beating the West. And after Nixon's visit to China, went basically allied with the U.S. against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and all that. Now, the people who did that are no longer power in China. People who are more to the left of them are less pro-capitalist, which is part of why the U.S. is endlessly demonizing China these days, and why you get frickin' Jane Goodall, which people make her into such a hero, and she silently speak about politics. No, actually, she has a long history of speaking about politics and saying some really stupid things. It's not just the video she had published after her death. Yes, she doesn't like Elon Musk or Trump, and she said that in the video that was published after her death. But she was also, I hate Xi Jinping. She probably knows nothing about the guy. In fact, actually, I've heard videos from when she was alive where she was just less openly, but still throwing shade at China, automatically believing the propaganda about them when she's a biologist. She knows nothing about it. Now, I mean, my training is in biology, but I've spent a lot of time examining world events. I don't believe, and I don't drink the imperialist freaking Kool-Aid, which if you listen to a lot of Jane Goodall stuff, she does. She seems to think the problem in the U.S. is just the wrong faction is in power to a certain degree and billionaire power, and I mean that's true, but she's incapable of facing that the fundamental rot is inherent to the system. It's inherent to capitalism. Destroying the planet. She was an environmentalist. She's dead now, but she died of old age or whatever. But she was a huge environmentalist. But she was incapable of facing that the demand for infinite economic growth. Well, most of the benefits of that growth go to the billionaires, and because that ordinary people still live hard lives, and then they think, oh, well, we'll have more economic growth, so that there'll be more money and we'll get decent amounts. But somehow, no matter how much the economy grows, all the benefits go those at the top, and ordinary people still suffer. And this push for infinite growth on a finite planet is what leads to environmental devastation, is leading to us being on the verge of a climate disaster. But it was funny for Goodall to throw shade at China, because China is, of all the countries in essentially a developing economy, wealth level, mid-level, kind of like the Soviet Union was before it collapsed, is probably the most ecologically responsible of all those countries. Didn't used to be, but it's invested massively in wind and solar. And people say it didn't used to be, well, it did all these horrible things in the past. Most countries that were that poor, as China was then, did horrible things. The fact that they've pivoted to investing in renewables, even if it's because they think that eventually they have to do so anyways, and there's money to be made from it by being an early adopter. They may have some short-term reasons why it's more profitable, but it's still probably not optimal for economic growth. They're doing it partly because they're legitimately concerned about climate change. And the diplomatic implications of ignoring it, which the U.S. is concerned about neither. It's a global empire that doesn't give a shit. Figures it can just propagandize people into liking it, and so it doesn't give a shit if people are annoyed at us about ignoring climate change. U.S. billionaires, and they've been quite successful in that, since so much of the media around the planet is owned by billionaires who are allied with the U.S. So the U.S. has not gotten nearly enough grief over its complete irresponsibility about the climate disaster. There are poor countries that are definitely contributing to the problem. Brazil chopping down the rainforest. Although the current administration there has been good about trying to stop that, but there have been past ones that have been very, very shit about it. Roommate is from Brazil, and because he's into evangelical religious nonsense, I would bet dollars to donuts he probably supports some of those past ecologically rapacious regimes. So the current government, he probably doesn't like them. Because somehow evangelicals always come out on the side of destroying the planet, as if that was something Jesus would have done. Freaking ridiculous. Jesus was around today, he'd be giving people a lecture about protecting the planet, I guarantee it. But partly because it affects the poor, and Jesus was always saying, give your money away to the poor, take care of the poor, look out for the poor, the poor are blessed, all these things. He would not be calling for completely ignoring something that's going to cause billions of poor people to starve to death. But somehow evangelicals, they always come out on the side of that. It's insane. I've spent more than enough time around them. I was living in the middle of nowhere in a rural area, and there were tons of evangelicals around, and they all thought climate change was some sort of scam. And I'm like, go screw yourself. You don't know science. I do. Whenever I try and talk to these people, they would spew some pseudoscience and refuse to listen to actual scientific facts. They would quote these people who weren't actually credible scientists, who most of the time had some nonsense degree from like a mail-order university, basically, and then would spread misinformation on YouTube about climate change, or these days, I think they would be banned from YouTube even. They'd be on some alt-right media. In fact, actually, some of them were on alt-right platforms even back then. Some of these climate change deniers. I met very, very few evangelicals who ever took the climate disaster seriously. I was not raised evangelical. I was raised a more traditional Christian denomination. I met a lot of people in those churches who took climate change much more seriously. There are Christians who are very big about ecological stewardship, but they're usually not part of these charismatic evangelical churches. They're usually like, more mainstream churches, where the preachers will give sermons about protecting the planet or responsibility of stewardship. I've heard such sermons. I've sat through them. So I'm not just claiming this out of nowhere. The fact that these sermons are given is a fact that I've seen with my own eyes. Well, heard with my own ears anyways. Yeah. Anyways, and multiple different, more mainstream churches. I'm, of course, very left-wing, but gone to a variety of churches. This was an actual political movement in the United States. I'd probably consider myself a Christian democratic socialist or Christian socialist, though in some countries Christian socialist stands for center-right parties instead of actual socialist parties that point out that Jesus would have been a socialist if he was alive today. And reject the Marxist fascination with atheism that's far too common. Marx himself was Catholic, but with a partially Jewish upbringing. He deeply resented his parents had been forced to convert from Judaism to Catholicism, and he deeply resented organized religion. But people mix up his own personal biases. He also said some shitty things about the disabled and occasionally even racial minorities, and they somehow take to heart just because these militant atheists came into being around the same time. They were looking for a home and they found it there, and now they've basically taken over a lot of the Marxist movement. It's something that really needs a group that if there's any group that should be purged as in removed from the ranks, not violence. Sometimes that term people think it to mean, but there's any group that should be removed from the ranks of socialist parties. It's these militant atheists who don't give a shit about any socialism. They just want to destroy churches. They have no place in trying to make the world better. They aren't really interested in making the world better. They're just violently against organized religion. Latch on to any movement that'll have them. Maybe some people think that's a little cynical, and there are some organized religions that are seriously dangerous, like the Scientology nonsense and cults that are around. They're technically organized religions, and some of these evangelical churches, they can be seriously damaging to society, but that doesn't mean all religion is bad. Absolutely not. But, excuse me. Not to mention, it's a very Christian-centric thing. People usually, when they're talking about religion, they're not talking about like Buddhism or something. It's specific, more aggressive religions, which tend to be the dominant ones because they forced everyone to adopt their religion at the point of a sword historically, as Christians did. Although this is often not, it's written out of history, but like the Crusades and such were about forcing people to adopt Christianity at the point of a sword, and then making up claims about people not being allowed to be Christian in the Near East, which were not true at the time, but actually it became true because of the Crusades. Christians, Muslims, and Jews all lived in relative harmony in the Middle East before the Crusades happened. Afterwards, a lot of these people were forced to convert to Islam because of the Crusades. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. But also because the Mongol invasions and the destabilization of the Arabic world and the end of the golden age that they've been experiencing because of the Mongols. The lines get a little weird with that, but you got to remember it wasn't just Genghis Khan as his successors. And then there was a whole like domino effect after that. So a series of invasions from the east, and it wasn't just the Mongols. There were some other civilizations that did the same thing. The Turks, actually, because the Turks started off as a nomadic horde from east of modern-day Turkey, like I guess Kazakhstan or something. Although they settled down and became very civilized later. I'm not throwing shade, but historically, the nomadic invasions destabilized the Middle East, particularly the Mongols. And the Mongol, the Turkic, and I'm trying to remember, there was another, the Timurids? I think the Timurids was the third group. And it caused the Middle East, that had been the center of science and learning, and the Islamic world, to fall behind the rest of the world. And helped give Europe, which had been under cultural and military pressure, enough breathing room that they were able to pull ahead. At the same time as certain key innovations, the dominant societies has ebb and flow, because certain stages of technological development will tend to favor one part of the world or other. And the Industrial Revolution, the early Industrial Revolution, really favored Europe, because it enabled huge population growth of cities. But to have huge population growth, you have to have the food to feed them, which the Middle East does not, with its large amounts of desert terrain and very ecologically fragile, fertile river valleys, but ecologically fragile. If you start over farming, you can degrade those farmlands very easily. You start damming up the rivers, which happened all over Europe in the Industrial Revolution. Rivers were dammed for factories without understanding the consequences to agriculture, or not caring. The Middle East would have had a much harder time doing like steam Industrial Revolution just for climatic reasons. Whereas, an era of global trade today makes certain countries better off than they would otherwise be. Development of modern medicine also helps with tropical diseases. So the point is different eras in history, different parts of the world can be dominant. And Europe was hitting an era that was going to benefit at the same time that the Middle East got screwed by nomadic invasions. And that China was in a relative dark age. Or was about to enter one, I think. I don't remember the exact timing on that, but Europeans think, they won because they were a superior civilization. No, they won because they got lucky. They happened to hit a golden age right at the correct time to conquer much of the world. And once you're already ahead of the rest of the world, it becomes much easier to stay there. Or, when a particular empire collapsed, as many did, like the Spanish Empire, for your immediate neighbors to take over that empire instead of some other nation across the world. So when the Spanish Empire lost a lot of its dominance, the French kind of took over. And then when the French Empire was starting to collapse, then the British took over. The British Empire, while it got big fairly early, it actually couldn't really compete with the French for quite a while. In like the 1600s, I think it was. French were just so militarily dominant. But especially after the Napoleonic Wars, which actually happened because France was already losing its dominance relative to England, which is already in the 1800s after the foundation of the United States. But really, 1700s, France started to really slip. And England took over as the predominant global power. But went Spain, France, England. These countries are all right next to each other, as tends to happen. Oh, shoot. I didn't hear anything on Discord, but I was going to do a multiplayer stream this evening. I was so distracted by people waking me up to freaking smoke alarms that I forgot about that. Alright, well,
better contact the guy. Maybe I can still do something. I wish you all the best, viewers. Take care of each other. Be kind yourselves. And may you always find a guiding star to lead you home. Adieu.